Our top story. For years, women in Iran have lived with their rights severely restricted, with their voices silenced and freedom snatched away. But in the last 40 days or thereabouts, the Islamic Republic is witnessing protests like never before. 22-year-old Mahsa Amini's death in the custody of Iran's morality police has ignited anger among people across the country. The protests have now turned into a people's movement. Protesters have been chanting, "Death to the dictator." It's the same cry that had toppled the Shah regime in 1979. Guns, tanks, fireworks, the mullahs must get lost. That is another slogan that the women of Iran are chanting while taking off and burning their hijabs in city after city. The women of Iran have had enough of the men in turbans controlling their lives, dictating how they must dress, travel, work. So now they've taken their protests directly to these turbaned mullahs. Let's look at these 5 videos from Iran that have been circulating on the social media, showing protesters, in a sense, teaching a lesson to the Shia clerics who they blame for having led the country into misery and chaos with their religious dictatorship. This first video is from one of the protests that have been held following the death of Mahsa Amini. An Islamic cleric walks while protesting. While protesters chant slogans, they knock off his pristine white turban. And as the cleric walks towards his turban to pick it up, the protesters kick it away. Looking at the number of protesters and the rage among them, the mullah chooses to walk away. On to the second video. A cleric is seen standing near his car when a young boy wearing a hoodie walks towards him and knocks off his turban, chanting, "Down with Khamenei." Here's the third one. A young man runs towards a mullah and does the same, knocks off his turban. The next one is from Qom. The city is called the epicenter of the mullahs. As an old cleric walks across the street, his turban is taken off. And the fifth video that we are playing for you, this one is from an Iranian university. Women students are seen chanting slogans as they see a mullah arriving. And before his turban could be taken off, some from the college authorities walked up to the mullah asking him to back off because of the protests. Fearing the protesters, the mullah then turns around and walks off. Knocking off the turbans of the mullahs has become a new campaign in Iran. There are several such incidents across cities in the Islamic Republic. Protesters in Iran are mostly young. There are students from schools and universities. They make up around a third of Iran's population. So far, they've chanted slogans, they have chased Ayatollah Khamenei's officials out of their schools, braved several crackdowns, even thrown Molotov cocktails at security forces. The protests against the supreme leader of Iran are only escalating. The protesters are burning billboards with images of the supreme leader. Students have been tearing down Ayatollah Khamenei's posters, even stomping on them. Some of the biggest protests have been in conservative cities and in female universities like Al-Zahra in Tehran. There are very few who have answered Ayatollah's calls to mobilize. The security forces, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, have stood loyal so far. The largest demonstrations have seen tens of thousands take to the streets, not the millions who toppled the Shah. So, for the protesters, the road is long and uncertain, but what is certain is that Ayatollah Khamenei and the Islamic Republic are in deep trouble. For more on this story, we're now joined by David Patrick Arakos, who's a journalist and author of the book War in 140 Characters. David, thanks very much for speaking to WION. Now, how do you view this significant escalation that we've seen in these protests across Iran? Many are saying that these protests are, in a sense, unprecedented, protests of the kind that haven't been seen in decades, perhaps not since 1979, since the downfall of the Shah. Do you think that there is a legitimate reason to draw parallels between those protests and the ones that we are witnessing today?
Yes, absolutely. So look, these are in fact unprecedented in the history of the Islamic Republic. First of all, let's not understand, these do not exist in isolation. COVID saved the regime in many ways, because throughout 2019, people were on the streets many times, but they were forced back in through COVID. Look, the reason these protests are so dangerous for the regime, look, 2009, if your viewers remember the 2009 Green Revolution, that was a protest about vote rigging. There, the protesters wore the colour green of the candidate Mir Hussein Musavi, who was, the election was stolen from him. They were protesting about vote rigging. This is not about that. This is about the very essence of the Islamic Republic themselves. They're not wearing green or the candidate of any colours. They are tearing down the symbols, the images of Ayatollah Khamenei and Ayatollah Khomeini, which are visual shorthands for the regime itself. The protests are national. They bisect class and gender and demographics. So yes, these are truly unprecedented in the history of
truly unprecedented, and the women of Iran have in fact been hailed around the world for standing up for their rights. You of course make an interesting point that this is no longer just about the hijab or the oppression that the women of Iran may have faced all their lives. This is now a direct challenge to the Islamic Republic and to the Supreme Leader himself, because hardly ever before have we seen, let's say, posters, banners, pictures and images of the Supreme Leader being torn down in the manner in which it's happening now. While it began with the women burning their hijabs and cutting off their hair, now it has gone to another level where they are taking the fight to the mullahs. We've seen their turbans being knocked off. Now, that's a very powerful statement that is being made by these women. The question really is, how do you see this playing out? Because even though the Iranian authorities have done everything in their power to brutally crack down on these protests, with more than 200 people losing their lives in recent weeks, there are no signs of these protests abating.
Look, I mean, that's a very good point. Look, and I want to make the hijab point. You sort of say, it is about the hijab in the sense that the hijab has become the symbol of everything that is oppressive about this regime. Look, you are right. It's women taking the fight to the mullahs. It's people standing up. Now, as it stands, the problem that the protesters face is there is no leader. So we saw in the Arab Spring, people mobilized in Egypt. They forced Mubarak out. He resigned, but there was no one to take his place. Right now, there is no, if you like, in 1979, there was Ayatollah Khomeini. The protesters need their own version of him. So as long as there is no leader, who will replace the mullahs? But this does not detract from the fact that, I think this is the beginning of the end for the regime. Now, is the end going to come in 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, 1 year? I don't know. It could be 2, 3 years. But it has lost all legitimacy now. It's the beginning of the end for them.
Well, those are very strong and powerful words coming from you, David. The beginning of the end for the regime. That's what you believe it is. We'll have to wait and see how this pans out, but certainly more power to the women of Iran for having shown so much courage. It's an absolute inspiration for women around the globe. Thank you so much, David, for joining us.